Comcast has built a broadband network with one simple purpose: to keep customers connected every single day. In the last 10 years, we have invested $30 billion and $15 billion since 2017 alone to keep America's largest gig-speed broadband network fast, secure, and reliable. Because more Americans rely on Comcast to stay connected, we work around the clock to build a better network every single day. Comcast. Better today, even better tomorrow. Learn more at comcast.com/network.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to New Books in African Studies, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. I'm Sarah Katz, a host for this channel. Today, I'll be talking to Professor Sheikh Anta Baboo about his new book, The Muridia on the Move: Islam, Migration, and Placemaking. Professor Baboo, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Sarah.
So to start, I wonder if you'll tell us a little bit about your background and kind of how it is that you came to become a historian.
Thank you, Sarah, for this question. I think I really developed my interest in the study of history when I was a little boy growing up in a small town in West Central Senegal. My father did not have a formal education, but he was a historian in his own right. He knew a lot about the pre-colonial and colonial history of Senegal. He was a devout follower of Ahmadou Bamba and the Muridiya. And, growing up as the little child, and he was a little old and less mobile, traveling less, I really learned a lot just sitting with him and him telling stories and sometimes arguing with historians on Senegalese radio and radio at that time, and just learning from him. And also my brother, my older brother, was a elementary school teacher. And our house was the hangout for all his friends. And being the little boy around, I was the one making tea for them. I was then going to elementary school and later on to middle school and high school, and just listening to them arguing politics, about, the French colonization in Senegal, its legacy, complaining about the corruption of Senegalese post-colonial government, but also debating international politics. I mean, the war in Vietnam, for example, what was going on in the Soviet Union. And my brother was a subscriber to many magazines, particularly one that I remember, Afrique Asie, which was a left-leaning magazine where I could go and read. At that time, I could read. I was going to school. I could read articles about, what was going on in the Israeli-Palestinian war. And just growing up and really getting hooked, interested in the virus of history. And then what all of that did for me was when I started to go to school and to study, I was really very good at history and geography. And I had my best grade in the discipline of history and geography.
And then how did you come to write Muridia on the Move, and kind of how does this relate to your previous research?
I would say that the idea of writing the Muridia on the Move really originated in field work I conducted in central Harlem in the late 1990s, working on a seminar paper. I spent a few days in the section of 116th Street between Malcolm X and Frederick Douglass Boulevard, interviewing Senegalese, visiting them in their home and workplaces, and just, hanging around and observing street life. And I was really fascinated by what I saw, the way people dressed, the restaurant, the mosque, the store and what was sold in those stores. I found all of that really quite fascinating. And I was fascinated by the fact that many of these people who actually came to the United States penniless, with no money and with no English, were able to make so a comfortable life for themselves in the United States, in a city where they should have been gotten lost, really, because, New York City is a huge metropole, one of the largest in the world, and many of these people came from small towns, small villages in Senegal. I was really fascinated by their ability to adjust and to live and to be comfortable in New York City. So after completing my research, I really wanted to know more about this. And I wanted particularly uh, to learn about how they were able to achieve what they achieved in New York. And what I learned very quickly was that these people that I was studying in New York City was truly transnational migrants. These were people that were actually connected to other Senegalese Murid immigrants around the world, that they were embedded in transnational network that crisscrossed actually three continents. And that's what took me actually to write this book. So immediately after finishing my fieldwork and writing my paper, I start really thinking about a project that will be based on my fieldwork. But I couldn't do it because I needed first to finish my dissertation and to finish my first book, which was based in my dissertation. And after all of that was done, I dusted up my old files, look at my interviews, and really starting to get to work to try to get this job done and to respond to the question I asked myself in the beginning: how did this Murid actually able to achieve what they achieved in New York, given their own backgrounds?
So,
So this book basically is a response to that question I asked myself.
so
Then,
this book started while you were also writing a kind of deeper history about Ahmadou Bamba. That was your first book.
exactly.
Interesting. And then before we get kind of into the meat of the book, I wonder, you've mentioned already just, observing, but I wonder if you could talk more a little bit about your research methods, particularly given that the sort of the multi-sided nature of this project sort of makes methods all the more kind of complex.
Absolutely. There are clearly challenges in writing a book set in three continents. You have, the logistical challenges, just getting the funding, getting the logistics, deciding about where to go and whom to talk to. But I think the most daunting challenge is really the intellectual challenge. Because, as you know, immigrants' lives are deeply shaped by the national identities and politics of the countries where they settle. And if one wants to write a truly transnational history, one needs to find themes that cut across borders to be able to connect those multi-sided, that kind of really kind of multi-sided history, and connect the stories of those different diaspora. And the first intellectual challenge was really, how do I find themes that can bring this community together, that can allow me to tell a story that cross borders, cross national identities, and cross national immigration politics and national idiosyncrasies. So I knew that I needed to find topics that can bring borders, that can bridge borders, and allow me to write a truly transnational history as I wanted to do. So I kind of thought about really three lines of inquiry. First, uh, I wanted really to try to find how these Murids were able to make a place for themselves wherever they went. I wanted to discuss the issues of belonging. How do they negotiate local political context and local cultural context? And I also wanted to learn more about how are these Murids actually both embedded in those transnational networks that crisscross three continents, but at the same time anchored in their cities of Tuba. So I was interested really in looking at this double embeddedness in the diaspora, yet firmly anchored in the city, the holy city of Tuba.
And then also, too, I wonder if you could reflect on a little bit both on the research as well as the writing process, and how doing this book compared to your first book, which was sort of more kind of, classically historical, for lack of a better way of putting it. Whereas this book certainly is a work of history, but it's kind of a history of the present. And it sort of, uses a lot of, maybe more, it includes a lot more contemporary events. And so, yeah, I wonder what the process was like, kind of comparing the two books, both in terms of doing the research, but also did you find the writing process itself was different for you?
Well, it took a longer time to write this book, definitely, much longer time. Um, as we said already, this is multi-sited. The first book was based in Senegal. What I had to do was um, archival work, mostly in Senegal, some in France, and that was it. The rest of it is to do field work in the Morit heartland of Western Senegal. That is what I had to do in order to be able to start sit and writing this book. Now, when you come to the Muridi and the Move, your first challenge is historiographical, because most of the scholarship on the Muridi on the Move, if you just go to the bibliography and look at my footnotes, it's mostly work written by social scientists. It's sociologists, it's anthropologists, it's geographers, it's political scientists. It's just how the scholarship is. Historians do write about migration, but they write about it differently. Mostly, it's in the case of Africa, for example, we have work on pre-colonial migration, we have work on colonial migration, but contemporary migration, it's really the preview of political scientists, anthropologists, and so forth. So I had to find a way to be a historian in a subfield dominated by social scientists. How can I make my own voice relevant, and how can I write a history of this migration that engage the historiography, which is mostly social scientists, but at the same time satisfy my method of inquiry and writing as a historian. Now, one way of doing it is trying to always connect past and present. And something that helped me do this was I'm really continuing a chapter in my first book. If you look at my first book, there is a chapter that is the last chapter, I believe, that is based on Amadou Bamba living in Jurbel. And what I tried to do in that book was to try to understand how was it possible for Amadou Bamba in Jurbel to accommodate colonial rule. This is somebody who is always looking for Dar al-Islam, a place where Islam is comfortable. But yet he was confined in the heart of Dar al-Kufr, the house of unbelief, because Jurbel was an escal. That's a town built by the French. And one of the arguments that I made in that book was space making was one of the tools that Ahmadu Bamba actually used to make himself comfortable in Jurbel, using Islamic architecture in order to build his houses, naming places based on Muslim names, organizing religious ceremonies, and so forth. And he was able to carve out within this Dar al Kufr, or house of unbelief, he was able to cave out, a place for Islam that make him believe that although he's under French custody, he is still a Muslim, he is still comfortable, he still live in place which is part of the land of Islam. So that idea that actually took and run with it, and really try to see how these diasporic Murids are continuing to live that experience of Amadou Bamba by trying wherever they go to recreate a land for Islam where they feel comfortable living.
And I imagine, too, if the scholarship on migration, you say it's mostly done by social scientists, I also imagine it's mostly done by outsiders and not people like yourself who are, in a sense, part of the Moridia diaspora. So actually, I was also wondering if you could kind of reflect. You mention a little bit in the book about how your own identity as an active member of the Moridia diaspora, and that you are kind of consistently in conversation with other Murids. And so I wonder kind of how that feedback shaped or informed your research. Like, did you ever kind of maybe present some information and got some pushback from other people, and that kind of, informed the directions your research took? Yeah.
So when you write African history, and certainly in this case, particularly the history of Islam, you just have to understand that the historiography will be dominated by others, by Europeans. It's just the history of the discipline itself and the history of discipline in the context of Africa itself, because our universities are much younger than universities in the West and others. And Africans really started to write about their history only from the 1960s. So that the body of scholarship that you deal with, of course, the situation has changed since. But to a large extent, when it comes to the Muridia, the scholarship is still dominated by voices of Americans, French and others, British, who actually wrote about the Muridia. Now, yes, I try to explain in the book that I enjoy what I call the position of the insider. That I'm talking to people who sometimes identify with me very much, and with whom I feel kind of bond. Really, there is an advantage to that. There is reward to that because it can open door that might not be accessible to others. That's the upside of things. But one should be aware also of the pitfall of the insider's positionality, because you might yourself perhaps subconsciously indulge in self-censorship, or you might be manipulated by people because you would like to preserve connection within the community. You don't want to offend people. Yes, this is the reality that whoever write about their history and their people actually confront. It's not something that in some ways is only relevant to me. It's relevant to any historians actually writing about their people or about their history, because when one writes about a culture one share and cherish, what tended to be less skeptical and what tended to really listen and to convey the story that are conveyed to you. But I believe that having this position of an insider, and here I'm really borrowing from the French scholar Paul Ricoeur, who write a lot about the insider's perspective in history. I don't think that it's a handicap, really. I think that it doesn't disable ability to write critically and objectively about the history. I think what is important for the historian is whatever your positionality be, is to be aware of the historical method of inquiry and criticism, and to apply that criticism to your sources. Whether you are an insider or an outsider, what is just important is to be aware of your kind of method of inquiry, and critical thinking and objectivity, and your ability to take a distance from your sources and to reflect critically. I think this is not something that only should be a concern by the insider. It should be a concern about any historians writing about the history of a people he actually value.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's maybe turn to the book itself. So in the book, you start by kind of giving a bit of a historical background of the Muridia, particularly in terms of migration and how this sort of reflects on the life of the founder, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, which you've already kind of mentioned already. But perhaps could you kind of expand a bit, particularly for listeners who might know next to nothing about that history?
Mm. Well, the Muridia was founded by Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, and he's a Senegalese holy man who lived in the late 19th century. He was born around 1850, 1855, but was mostly active in the late 19th century. And the late 19th century coincided with French colonial conquest and rule of West Africa. So Ahmadou Bamba, like many Muslims, found it as his duty, as his responsibility to preserve the Islamic identity and culture of the Senegalese people. But unlike many Muslims, particularly militants who called for jihad against the French, he called for peaceful social and spiritual renewal through education. So he felt that the best way to respond to the dismal condition of Senegalese society at that time, but Wolof society at that time, was not really to take the sword and to try to fight, but to return to God as he felt, and to do spiritual purification as Sufis actually do, and to try to transform society through education in a form that you call tarbiyah. And tarbiyah for him is a holistic form of education that aim at transforming the body, the soul, and the mind. And that's what he envisioned to do. And the way of doing it for him was to found the Muridiyah, which is a Sufi order, particularly oriented out toward education and toward a kind of cultural renewal, or Islam in the context of the whole of state in Senegal.
And then in the book, you describe how kind of after World War II, things sort of start to change a bit, and that Morids begin to kind of migrate into cities like Saint Louis and Dakar. Can you describe a little bit about kind of how they went about placemaking in these cities that they're arriving to?
Yes. Well, perhaps I need to preface this by saying that there is a history of mobility among the whole of state in Africa and Senegal before the coming of the French. But what really changed, especially with regard to the Muridiya, was the transition from rural migration to rural urban migration, where you gradually see Murid moving to the city, and after World War II, not only moving to the city, but settling in the city. Now, the fact that they really became settlers in the city transformed completely their perspective, because now one needed to make the city home. Before that, home was, the holy cities, the across West Central Senegal. Now the city is home. And the same question that I asked about Amadou Bamba in Jurbel, and making Dar al Kufr, the land of Islam, here also the Murid wanted to find ways of making the city a space for the Murid. Because the French did not envision the city as a land of Murid, wall of farmers, illiterate, as the French would say, unsophisticated. Their place is in the rural areas of Senegal. Yeah, they can come in as laborers, but they are not expected to settle and to be part in the city. They are not considered to be part of the citizenry. So that what the Murid really tried to do was, how do we make the Muridiya a religion of Senegalese citizen in the post-World War II era? The Murid drove from what they knew the best, turn their rural institution of Dara, these are the school that I was talking about earlier, into Daira, a new institution that could serve as an instrument to continue to protect and develop Murid identity in the city, and to give Murid ways of adapting to their new life as ways of making life in the city meaningful.
You also note, especially I think in Dakar, that there's also a way of parades, of sort of certain literally taking the space and referencing back to history by the Morids in Dakar. Can you describe a little bit about that?
Yes, I mean, turning the city into the secular French city, into a Murid holy place, really entail a lot of different actions. It was not only having those dairas where Murids actually move every Sunday to sing Amadou Bamba's Qasida, or holy poetry, to kind of socialize, to connect money in order to support disciple that may run in trouble with the police or just needed funding to start their business. That was only part of the picture. The only aspect was, how do you turn the city space into Murid space? These involve different kinds of activities. One of them was parade, and I discuss how actually the Murid transform a traditional French parade for example, November 11, which commemorates the liberation of Paris. How did they try to transform into a Murid event, because November 11 also coincide with the date when Amadou Bamba's return from exile in Gabon. Um, how did they also organize these annual festivals? One, two, three actually in Dakar, um, and how they try to name their own store and their own neighborhood after Murid names. For example, where I live in Dakar now is not far from a new neighborhood who was developed by a Murid developer and whose name is Khadim, Kër Khadim, the house of Amadou Bamba. So you have all this initiative of space making developing. Space making meaning here renaming space, but also infusing new cultural contexts in space. And how do you do that? You do that by singing songs, you do that by parade, you do that by exhibiting religious icons, and you do it also through those parades that I was talking about earlier. So all those initiatives actually help to kind of remake, to reshape, to refashion space in a way that makes space actually align to Murid culture and to Murid identity.
Yeah, as you note, there is this sort of tension between sort of both Morid and colonial heritage kind of vying for space. And you mentioned that the Mouridia faced some resistance, especially in San Luis, among those that kind of wanted to preserve the city's colonial heritage. So can you kind of explain those tensions as it pertains to San Luis a bit?
Yes, I mean the dynamic in Dakar in Saint Louis is quite different. In Saint Louis, I see the clash of two post-colonial identities. Saint Louis, of course, is the first uh, uh, city in the Atlantic coast of Africa colonized by the French. They settled there in the 17th century. Saint Louis was the capital of French West Africa. It was also the capital of Senegal. Uh, Saint Louis, along with three other communes in Senegal, benefited from French citizenship. They had the right to vote, including in French national elections. So they elected their own mayor. They had their own tribunal that followed French common law rather than indigenous law, which is the law applied to French subject. So they felt, and they fought in the French army, not in the colonial kind of tirailleur army, and they felt a relationship to France, which common Senegalese or Senegalese that live in the protectorate, those are called subject of France, really do not feel. So they believe that there is an identity here to preserve. They don't see their attachment to France and their attachment to the memory of colonialism as a betrayal of a French of French independence or French citizenry. They consider it as an integral part of their identity, and they don't see a conflict between their kind of post-colonial identity and their colonial identity. This is very different from people like the Murid who actually live in the protectorate and were French subject and to whom indigenous law was applied and who were people who did not enjoy French citizenship. So that what the Murid wanted was to erase that colonial memory, which for them represent the oppression of their leader, Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, whom, as I said, was judged actually in Saint Louis, sentenced to be exiled in Gabon, where he went for 7 years. So that for the Murid, the palace for the governor in Saint Louis, the statue of General Faidherbe, who is really the colonial founder of Senegal, for them, all of that represent oppression. All of them represent a past they would like to forget and to erase. And what they want is to showcase Amadou Bamba as the true liberator of Senegal and the one who should be celebrated because he was the one who brought Senegalese their dignity. So you have this clash of really post-colonial identities that is going on in Saint Louis. In the case of Dakar, is in fact completely different because in Dakar, it's mostly a kind of city where the Lebu, or the majority population, never actually had the relationship that the citizen of Saint Louis had with France. Although Lebu also at some point benefited from French citizenship, just as in Saint Louis, but they never developed that kind of Francophile identity that the people of Saint Louis developed.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So one of the first places that the Maurides begin to migrate outside of Senegal is Cote d'Ivoire. So kind of how do they end up there? Like why Cote d'Ivoire? And then how do they manage to maintain their connection to Touba in Senegal?
Yeah, well, Cote d'Ivoire is interesting. For a variety of reasons. One of them being that it was really the economic engine of French colonial Africa. In the post-colonial era, Cote d'Ivoire had the most advanced economy in West Africa. Um, and not only Cote d'Ivoire had that history of being really the kind of economic engine of West Africa, but there is a long history of Senegalese migration to Cote d'Ivoire, which was to some extent encouraged by the French colonial administration. Um, Cote d'Ivoire was conquered well before Senegal was conquered. Senegal had a much developed system of education, and many of the human resources that actually France used in its colonies that were colonized after Senegal were actually administered by Senegalese auxiliaries or Senegalese helpers. Uh, it's in Senegal where School William Ponty was located. This was the school where uh, colonial civil administrators in all of West Africa were trained. So that there is this kind of pre-colonial, not pre-colonial, but this colonial migration that already existed. Official migration that was to some extent sponsored and encouraged by the French, but also another type of migration which was not directly organized by the French itself. You've got many Senegalese citizens, they were citizens actually, mostly coming from the four communes of Saint Louis and Rufisque and Gorée and Dakar, who actually also worked with French uh, commercial companies who needed people that have literacy and numeracy and who found them in Senegal. So that while the French administration was hiring Senegalese civil servants to serve in the colonies, you also have French companies hiring Senegalese workers to work for them in those colonies. So that you have these two migrations that were underway even before Senegal was independent. Now, the Murid migration, to some extent, was an extension of that migration. Murid started to move. They will go to Bamako, to Mali, and then move to Cote d'Ivoire because they have a border there. And gradually, they followed in the footsteps of that colonial migration. And after independence now, that migration really continued to intensify. And until today, perhaps Cote d'Ivoire is the country where you have most Senegalese immigrants.
Great. And next, you discuss the Meridia in Gabon, which you kind of note is often referred to by Maurides as sort of the backyard of Touba, which is a sort of, evocative phrase. So how did it get that name?
Amadou Bamba was exiled in Gabon for 7 years and 7 months, and the Murid would say 7 days. 7 years, 7 months, 7 days. There is a symbolism of seven here. And that narrative, the narrative actually of that immigration is really foundational to the Muridia itself. And Amadou Bamba as a martyr of French colonial oppression. And that narrative of suffering and triumph is really central to the Murid imaginary. Now, you can imagine when Murid started to migrate in Gabon in the 1960s, the first thing they tried to do was to try to trace Amadou Bamba's footprints in Gabon. Where has he been kept? What did he do there? And how can we memorialize this? And Murid themselves in Gabon, the entry told me that Gabon is the backyard of Touba. Why? Because when we wake up here, we're probably walking on places where Amadou Bamba has walked. We are praying on the same the same sand, the same land when Amadou Bamba has actually prayed. And you have many sacred Murid sites in Gabon, in Mayombe, in Lambaréné, and also in Libreville, places where Amadou Bamba actually stayed. And for Murid, the ultimate triumph would be to leave their footprints in the places where the French took Amadou Bamba in order to get rid of him. The ultimate triumph actually would be to just do that, to go where the French wanted to bring him, to destroy him, and to show their presence there as an ultimate testimony to the enduring success of Ahmadou Bamba against his French oppressors. So you can understand now why Gabon is so symbolic for all this multi-transnational diaspora.
Yeah, and then sort of in the process of the Mouride community sort of developing there, how is it that they kind of reclaim the spaces that Ahmadou Bamba sort of had sort of passed through?
First of all, history is important here. What those Murid told me is that when they started to gradually migrate to Gabon and started with Libreville, the capital, they asked the elders, do you know where Ahmadou Bamba actually settled, where he has been? What did he do? They look at their history, and then they look at also the Murid hagiography, where you have depiction of Gabon and what happened. And they try to match the hagiography with the space. That's where all started. So the first place they wanted to actually own was the place where they say Amadou Bamba stayed when he first came to Libreville, to Gabon, where they say which used to be his makeshift mosque, and where he say is the site where the French actually tried to kill him using a firing squad. And then the well which was there, which Amadou Bamba used actually to do his ablution, they wanted to own it because this was the most sacred place of the Mouridia, besides, where Amadou Bamba is buried in Senegal. I talk about the saga, the whole kind of the struggle to get this place, which was owned by a Christian who lived in France and then did not want his house to be transformed into a mosque. And then Murid started finding a way of buying it. When it was on the market, they just rushed actually to buy it. And after they bought it, they have built there a mosque, and they have invested there the kind of the most money that Murid actually has invested outside of Senegal. And then beyond that, you have also the other sites, and Murid are still struggling to some extent to memorialize those sites, but it's more difficult because one of them is located in the heart of the equatorial forest of Gabon. They visit it, they go and they come. The other one is a city that is not that far from Libreville, which actually they try also to memorialize. And there is a negotiation, for example, with the mayor of that city to try to put a plaque there, maybe build a mosque. This kind of a work of memory is continuing, and every generation is really trying to make sure that the memory of Ahmadou Bamba is inscribed in space. His footprints are inscribed in space, and the memory will last forever. One thing that I write about also is that Murid market in Libreville, the art market. And the story is quite fascinating because it was difficult for them to get the space, just as in the case of Dakar. Murid are not supposed to be in the city center, which is really the heart of the city, and which is a place for the French and for French educated Africans, for sophisticated people. These Murids are traders. Most of them do not even have a license to trade. They are mostly merchant and do not have much respect. And all the struggle to get that very prized kind of real estate space, and then naming it based on their own culture and managing it, all of that was really significant also for turning Libreville into a place for the Mouridia in the kind of place-making strategy.
Yeah, it's actually a nice segue to my next question, which is, then in the book, you sort of move on to two chapters that kind of concern the Mouridia in France, and kind of one interesting connection between this diaspora as well as the different diasporas in Africa, as well as later a bit New York City, is this global art market and sort of how they are able to sort of latch onto that and profit on that, which I found that like a very interesting thread that connects a number of your case studies. So I was wondering if you could sort of expand a bit on kind of how does this trade develop, and how is it that the Mouridia are able to excel in this market, And I wonder too, how do you find this maybe contributing to maybe larger discussions about sort of Muslims and art? I know that's a lot,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Yes. Well, I trace the origin of this trade diaspora, particularly in France, because what you see happening in France is different from what you see in Cote d'Ivoire. The occupation of Mourids are different. What really started the France network was really art trade by a specific people. They are called the Laube. It's a ethnic group in Senegal which really specialize in wood carving, and these are the first entrepreneur, I call them, to really discover the gold field that the trade in African art represented. And this happened after the World Festival of Negro Arts, that's how we Senghor call it, in 1966. Uh, I've been looking at the connection, how it is that these first Timuri traders who went to France actually went there just after 1966. My guess is the coming of Europeans buying art in Senegal really opened them up to the possibility of a market for the trade. So that many of these people that were specialized first in wood carving transformed into specializing in carving masks and carving artifacts that might be of interest to European buyers, and also turning into collectors. They started to travel across West Africa to buy art to sell to Europeans. This is really how the whole art trade started. And now, gradually, other Murid followed suit. I talk about two hubs, for example, the hubs in Paris, but also the hub in Strasbourg. Uh, Historians and anthropologists and social scientists debate about the connection between this trade and Murid identity itself. Some of them see it just as a continuation of the disciple master relationship. Uh, uh, Large traders in Strasbourg and in France playing the role of the sheikh, and retailers in the street of France becoming the disciple. I think it's more complicated than that. You see that I push back really in this culturalist approach to migration, and I think it's perhaps simpler than that. It's just people seeing an opportunity to earn resources, at the same time preserving their religious identity, to just take advantage of it. I don't think that the Murid relationship has any role to play in this. And in fact, my own research and the research of many scholars I actually quote in my work show that this was not something that was thought about, organized, and directed by leaders. This is really a bottom-up kind of grassroots migration where disciples themselves actually discovered opportunities to move around and sell these artifacts and just took advantage of it. Now, over time, the trade in mask, in artifact, gave way to other different trades. You see just people selling things in markets, you see taxi drivers, you see restaurant workers, and you see even people working in the French industry, automobile industry earlier on, branching out and really taking advantage of these opportunities to use those networks actually to travel across Europe, and across Africa, and then across Europe, and even now beyond Europe in the United States even.
There is another theme that gets raised in the section on France that comes up in other parts of the book as well, which is that there is this tension within the diaspora over how much to proselytize and sort of assimilate to the host community. So can you describe kind of how this tension plays out in France?
Yeah, well, this is really something that surprises me. I mean, when you write a book, sometimes you get surprised by things. I did not know really that you've got these clashes of Murid identity in the diaspora. You have those I call universalist, some of them Western educated, uh, some of them actually born in the diaspora, who believe that the mission of Murid disciple in the diaspora is to spread the good tidings, the good work of Amadou Bamba, to proselytize, to broaden the tent. That should be the mission. And in order to do that, you need to have some skills. You need to learn the local languages. You need to translate Amadou Bamba's work in local languages. You need to align Murid identity with global Muslim identity. You need to take, to some extent, distance yourself from wall of identity, which is very much consubstantial to Murid identity. You have those universalists. Then you have those who believe that the mission of disciple is to preserve Murid identity, to make sure that our children are not lost, to make sure that we don't lose our face in the diaspora, to consolidate our relationship with the center of the Muridia, to contribute to the kind of the shining of the Muridia in Senegal, help the Sheikh build the mosque, help them develop the charity, help them really continue to grow in Senegal, but make sure also that people who live in the diaspora don't lose their history, don't lose their culture. Our work should be that, should be our priority, should be that, rather than going to try to proselytize, to translate into English, into French. You don't need that. And that clash is real in the diaspora, both in France and in the United States. Now, the difference you have in France really, in the leadership of the Mouride in France is mostly made of young men, and particularly young men. You do have the role of women. I write a little bit about that, but particularly young men who, most of them actually have a graduate education. Most of them are sociologists or anthropologists, some of them political scientists. And they grew up in France. They know about the political debate about Muslim in France. And the way they imagine the Mouridia as part of that debate and that discussion. And they want to show a face of the Mouridia that can fit in the French idea of vivre ensemble. How can we live together as a diverse community, but a community that is aware of what they share together and go with that. And they believe that by staying in their wall of Murid identity, the Muridia is actually those who actually lead the Murid in Senegal is taking them away from that global dialogue in which the Muridia can actually thrive and become a major actor and a major player in the scene about Islam and Islamic identity in Senegal. I'm sorry, in France.
The world is racing to get back to normal and start meeting up in person again. But after the year we've all had, getting back to feeling normal takes time. If you're feeling overwhelmed by it all, you're not alone. Something like 50% of Americans struggle with their mental health. We all need help sometimes. I know I do. So what should you do? Well, you should ask for help. Talkspace makes it easy to get that help. Talkspace matches you with a licensed therapist and makes it easy to schedule live video sessions, all from the comfort of your device. You can start messaging your therapist the same day you sign up, and you work with your therapist on your own schedule without having to wait weeks for appointments. Whether you're a parent, a student, a millennial, or just someone having a hard day, Talkspace can help you feel better. Talkspace offers individual and couples therapy in addition to medication prescription services. Whether you're experiencing depression, anxiety, or other problems, Talkspace is the #1 online therapy platform to help you sort through any issue. Start feeling better with a single message. Match with a licensed therapist when you go to Talkspace.com and get $100 off your first month with the promo code NBN. That's $100 off when you use the code NBN at Talkspace.com.
And you mentioned that you go into kind of detail about these sort of two houses in Paris that have very different approaches to kind of how to kind of go about placemaking in the diaspora there. So can you maybe describe that? Yeah.
Yeah, you have Taverny and Aulnay-sous-Bois. In Taverny, the leader is an anthropologist, political scientist somewhere, who is very much committed to modernity. For him, the center should be the library. He invests a lot of money in the library, in organizing talk. I've been there, I think, 3 times to give talk. And he would like to put Murid intellectuals in dialogue with other Muslims and beyond, even with secular France. For him, the center should be open to everybody. It should reflect Islam as a universal religion, open to everybody. For example, when you go to the center, you will see not only Senegalese and Africans, you will see also Southeast Asian, South Asian, and even people from the Balkan, actually, people from Bosnia and Herzegovina and so forth, Muslim from there in Central Europe actually praying there. The sermon is done in French, not in Wolof, the local Senegalese language, and in Arabic sometimes. And you see, the caller of prayer could be anybody. It could be an Arab from North Africa, it could be a French, it could be anybody. And they are proud of saying that we're open to everybody. We are not tied to a country. We are not tied to a Sufi order. We are not tied to an ethnicity. And their major preoccupation is also to provide to young African of French descent a decent Muslim education, because they are very concerned about, as I write in the book, that the French state, of course, ignore completely religion. It's not concerned about it. And as far as education is concerned, Arab Muslim they consider to be a little bit too radical, really are leading the effort there. And they believe that they should provide an alternative Islamic education that can reconcile Islam with French identity. That is not controversial. So it's really their major role. Now you go to Aulnay-sous-Bois, it's all about how do we preserve our Senegalese Muslim community here. Here, the emphasis is not on Friday prayer, but it's on Dahira meeting. Every Sunday afternoon, people meet together, share food, they sing Ahmadou Bamba's Qasida, they do the community's business, they talk about newborn in the community, death in the community, events happening in Senegal, and how to contribute. They raise money to help the community. They start to provide some Islamic education, but in the traditional way it's done in Senegal. The teacher there is somebody who was sent by the Sheikh in Senegal to continue. The teacher at Taverny is a former civil servant who actually is retired now, Western educated, who is an alumni of the University of Dakar. He's the one who is giving the Quranic actually education in Taverny. So you can really see the differences. In Taverny, they don't really put much emphasis in socializing and in sharing food, which is a major religious ritual of the Murid. In Aulnay-sous-Bois, it's very important, especially to get the woman involved, to do the cooking, to raise money, to organize events, to invite actually singers to come in to do those such concert of spiritual music as the Sufi do. So you really see here, to some extent, two Murid Muslim identities that are to some extent really competing with each other. And sometimes you have tense relationship, as I explain in the book, between these two communities.
All right. So then the book turns to New York City. So how do the different trades and jobs the Morids do kind of change over time? Because you provide a kind of overview of that in the book.
Yes. New York City is the last stage. People really started to come here in the late 70s, first as sojourners going back and forth, seasonal migrant, led mostly by women and then the late 1970s, the early 1980s, you have a larger migration flow coming in. Most of them are step migrant, meaning migrating from Cote d'Ivoire, from Europe, and from somewhere else. And they came here with a baggage. They have already some experience walking the street of Paris, perhaps walking the street of cities in West Africa and Central Africa, and then they came to New York and continued that same tradition. One thing that they will really very early on specialize in is taxi driving, which you don't see in France, which you don't see in Senegal. Cab driving become really their main occupation, mostly driving taxis in the hot neighborhood of Harlem. Not yellow cab driving, but those I forgot the technical name of it, but it'll come. Gypsy cab driving. Thank you. So gypsy cab driving, and many of them paying a toll actually, doing that, because I talk about the number of Murid and Senegalese actually died in the process of driving taxis in those hot neighborhood. And here also, what is significant is the role of women. something you don't see anywhere else, which you see in New York with the number of women. Perhaps my research among the Senegalese, at particularly the Association of Senegalese in Senegal in America, and also among other Senegalese immigrants, is there seems to be some kind of balance between the number of Senegalese women and Senegalese men in Senegal in the migration. This is something unseen, never seen anywhere else. This is the only diaspora where the number of women may be equal to the number of men. And the reason for that is hair braiding. So hair braiding became really the gold mine of Senegalese women. They pioneered it actually. Now you have, of course, women from almost all of West Africa being working as hair braiders, and even beyond West Africa. I have seen Somali women, Sudanese women actually working as hair braiders. But the Senegalese women really pioneered this job in Washington, and then in Atlanta, Georgia, and in New York. And women really are central to this. The third major job, which we see really here in New York, which you don't see elsewhere, is restaurant. Uh, Many of you know what I'm talking about. If you've been to New York City and to Little Senegal, you certainly know about the number of Senegalese restaurants there. Um, the that are not really your typical restaurant until very recently, because these restaurants were also Grand Place. And all these places where Senegalese worked actually became Grand Place. These are hangouts where really people go to socialize, drink tea, play card, and talk about politics and about wrestling, about soccer, the things that they will discuss when they were in Senegal, especially during the summer. So that the street life here is really unique compared to, for example, the street life in other part of the Senegalese diaspora in Europe and in Africa. And this has something to say about the nature of multiculturalism in the context of America. In France, where multiculturalism and what the French call communautarism is really not welcome or is unwelcome, you don't see this vibrancy of Murid culture in the city. And I think the kind of multiculturalism that you see in New York City, which you can see in the form of all these cultural enclave, for example, Little Italy, Chinatown, all of that to some extent made possible Little Senegal and the other enclave that you have in New York City, where Murid culture and Senegalese culture in general is performed in public space.
Since you've mentioned a bit about Little Senegal, can you share kind of what is the future of Little Senegal and kind of what are the challenges that currently Little Senegal is facing?
Well, the future is really up in the air. It's not hopeful, to say it mildly. Many of the people I actually interviewed told me that it's just a matter of time before Little Senegal is completely gentrified, and the Africans who have been living there for more than 20 years, 25 years, leave and less the space to more affluent white immigrants who are really taking over. In the book, I describe a little bit what is happening to businesses, because business do not benefit from rent protection. So that a number of the store owners that I interviewed when I started to work in this book, my first field work in 1996, 97, they are no longer around. I talk about that store which used to sell Murid religious paraphernalia, which was really the headquarters of everybody. All researchers coming to do research on Senegalese, West African in general, and Murid in particular, that they hang out. That's where you go. I used to go there to buy cassettes and DVDs at the time when we had cassettes and DVDs, to buy religious texts, to buy stuff, and just to hang out and discuss with people. That place has left because they can no longer afford paying the rent. Restaurants are also moving further south where rent is affordable. Many people are who actually still live there are contemplating moving because they are being offered money they can't just refuse because gentrification had made rent so profitable now that you know, the owner of those buildings are ready to pay $50,000 just for people to leave and to go to other places. There is a restaurant that left 3 years ago. The owner actually told them that he was going to pay for the rent wherever they go for a number of months and give them cash to go. So that gentrification is really taking over Little Senegal. And I'm sad to say that perhaps for a future generation would not continue to build in my own research and to look at the future of Little Senegal, but because it looks like Little Senegal no longer has any future.
Yeah, some of the money that you cited was pretty mind-boggling in that chapter, just like how much people were being offered to vacate. You also detail in this section the relationship between Mooried migrants and the African American community in Harlem and New York City more broadly. So first, sort of, what was their relationship like with the Nation of Islam when they sort of first started arriving?
There was not a formal relationship with the Nation of Islam. And by the time the Murids started to come to New York in greater numbers, Warith Din Muhammad, who was the successor of Elijah Muhammad and who is a mainstream Muslim, really was the dominant figure of Islam in Harlem at that time. So the Malcolm Sabah's temple was transformed into Malcolm Sabah's mosque. And the relationship they built in the beginning, really they built with Warith Din Muhammad, who had become part of what you might say kind of Orthodox Islam or mainstream Islam. Now, what is interesting with regard to the Nation of Islam is what I discovered in my research is many of the early African American who joined the Muridia are all the followers of the Nation of Islam. Many of them, including here in Philadelphia, where I live, where the leader of the Murid community, African American Murid community, many of them told me that they followed the Nation of Islam before they left and came to the Muridia. And what is interesting here is that for many of these African American Murid, they were really not satisfied with the alternative to the Nation of Islam. When they went to Orthodoxy or when they went with the mainstream Islam, they were not satisfied with the alternative. What is the alternative? These are mosques led by South Asian or led by Arabs, and many of them felt unwelcome to some extent. Some even talking about kind of racial insensitivities and things of that sort. But I think what they were looking for really was an Islamic identity that tie Islam to the way they imagine Africa and Islam in Africa. And many of them were looking something that can link them back to Timbuktu, to Jenne, to Gao, to the vibrant history of Islam in medieval Africa. Many of them knew about this. Perhaps most of them did not learn about it at school, but it's really part of the kind of Muslim identity in America. Some even talk about the early Muslim that were enslaved and brought to America. They know about the history of Job ben Salomon and other Muslims that were actually came here in antebellum America, and they kind of they wanted to tie their Muslim identity in the 20th century to a deeper connection with African Islam. And for some of them, the Muridia offered that alternative. That through the Muridia, they see Timbuktu. Through the Muridia, they see Gao, and even through the Muridia, they see their ancestry. That are some of those early Muslims that were enslaved and brought to America during the Atlantic slave trade era.
Yeah, it's interesting just like how completely opposite of a view it is from sort of the stereotypes that get brought about by Islam noir, for example, by the French.
Exactly.
And yeah, I wonder too how much the TV series Roots sort of plays into that kind of interest in getting back to sort of Islam as practiced in Africa.
I think it has some effect. Probably everybody they interview actually knew about Roots. One of them, who is from Cleveland, told me clearly that the two things that brought me to the Muridia was Alex Ale and Malcolm X. Clearly making the connection you just talk about, that Kunta Kinte was a Muslim, and that the among the crime of slavery was erasing completely the identity of the enslaved, and erasing your identity also included erasing your culture, and Muslim Islam, as they imagine it, be one of the central element of those pre-colonial those the identity of those Muslims that were enslaved and brought here. So some of them really did have that connection in mind when they wanted to connect with an Islam that resonate better with the way they imagine their Muslim identity.
One person who comes up is Balozi Harvey, who has a really
Mhm.
fascinating background. I mean, just his biography was really interesting. So, who
Mhm.
was he, and kind of how does he become an important figure to the Moridia in Harlem?
Fascinating character. Balozi's parents were followers of Marcus Garvey. So he was already nationalist. I mean, it is in his family culture, nationalism was central to his identity growing up. And he converted to Islam after traveling to Tanzania to meet Julius Nyerere, and particularly the vice president of Tanzania at the time. That vice president's son uh, was studied with Balozi, Seton Hall, where they went together school, and that's how he got actually to travel to Tanzania, and that's really where he converted to Islam, and then the relationship with Nyerere continued even after he returned from Tanzania. He was called Balozi, Balozi meaning an ambassador, a representative, a mediator in Swahili. And he was very much involved in helping Nyerere hire African American who could actually help as advisors uh, in his socialist project in Tanzania. His relationship with the Muridia really developed after he met with Sheikh Murtada, who is the youngest son of Ahmadu Bamba, in around 1988. And his trip to Senegal, this is also connected you to Roots, because his trip to Senegal was linked to the Roots Festival, which the president of the Gambia actually organized for African American tourism to visit the village where reportedly Kunta Kinte was from. So that's during this visit, actually, he saw pictures and art form that he saw in a movie that was about the Muridia. So he immediately connected the two. A movie he watched, this is a documentary that he watched here in the United States, which had a segment on the Muridia, and the art he saw in that art shop run by a Murid. He asked about that. He asked about who is this guy? I mean, the picture of Ahmadu Bamba, the iconic picture of Ahmadu Bamba, and the storekeeper told him, "Oh, he's my sheikh, and he's actually I can take him to his son, who is Sheikh Murtada, who is very much a knowledgeable man that you might want to know." And that's how the thing started. The year after Sheikh Murtada traveled to the United States, wanted to meet him, he met with Balozi, and that was history. Balozi introduced him to the leadership of New York City, the Black African leadership of New York City, and the festival called Ahmadou Bamba Day was decided that day, July 27, 1988, became really the most important Murid celebration abroad, and that's how the history started. But I think Balozi was really somebody who was, to some extent, prepared to